The screaming had stopped 3 hours ago. Captain Sarah Mitchell pressed her back against the rusted metal wall of the abandoned radar station. Her fingers wrapped around the grip of her M4 carbine with the kind of desperation that came from 5 years of fighting the impossible. The silence was worse than the screaming. At least when they screamed, you knew where they were. "Contact, 2 o'clock, whispered Marcus, his voice barely audible through the comm unit clipped to her vest. The 19-year-old had been with her group for 8 months now, ever since they'd pulled him from the wreckage of Billings. Kid had good eyes, better instincts, but Sarah could hear the tremor in his voice that meant he was close to breaking. They all were. Sarah adjusted her position, peering through the cracked window of what used to be Fort Harrison's communications center. The Montana landscape stretched endlessly before them, a graveyard of twisted metal and sun-bleached bones where the 341st Missile Wing once stood proud. Now it was just another tomb in humanity's final chapter. Movement caught her eye. 3 figures stumbled across the broken tarmac, their movements that familiar jerky dance of the infected. Former airmen, judging by the shredded remnants of their uniforms. One still wore sergeant stripes, though the fabric hung in tatters from shoulders that had been gnawed to bone. "I see them," Sarah breathed into her comm. "Jenny, you got a clear shot from the tower?" "Affirmative," Jenny's voice crackled through the static. "Former Army sniper, steady hands even when the world ended. Want me to take them?" Sarah watched the 3 infected shuffle closer to their position. Standard protocol was elimination on sight, but ammunition was precious, and noise drew more of them. Always more of them. She was calculating angles, wondering if they could slip out the back exit, when the sky exploded with light. The flash was brilliant, searing, like someone had torn a hole in the heavens and let pure starlight pour through. Sarah threw herself to the floor, her retinas burning with afterimages as a sound like thunder married to music rolled across the wasteland. The windows of the communications center didn't just rattle. They sang, harmonizing with whatever force had just announced itself to their dying world. What the hell was that? Marcus's voice was tight with panic. Sarah blinked hard, trying to clear her vision. Purple and gold spots danced across her sight as she pulled herself up to the window. Where moments before there had been 3 infected airmen, now there was only scorched earth and something that made her heart forget how to beat. A ship. Not the crude metal boxes humans had hurled into space, but something that looked like it had been grown rather than built. Its surface rippled with colors that had no names, shifting between silver and deep blue, with veins of light pulsing beneath its skin like a living thing's heartbeat. It was maybe 30 feet long, elegant and organic, resting on the tarmac as if it had always belonged there. "Sarah, are you seeing this?" Jenny's voice had lost all its professional composure. "I'm seeing it," Sarah whispered, though she wasn't sure she believed it. The ship's surface began to change, sections flowing like liquid metal until an opening appeared. Not a door exactly, but a portal that dilated like an iris. Light spilled out. Not the harsh white of human technology, but something warm and golden that made Sarah think of summer afternoons she'd thought she'd forgotten. A figure emerged. He looked human at first glance, but Sarah had learned to distrust first glances. Tall, maybe 6'2", with dark hair and features that seemed familiar in a way that made her uneasy. He wore no uniform, no armor, just simple clothes that looked like they'd been cut from midnight sky. But it was his eyes that made Sarah's breath catch. Ancient eyes in a young face, carrying the weight of civilization she couldn't imagine. The man stepped onto the broken tarmac and looked directly at the communications center. At her. Sarah felt exposed, pinned like a butterfly under glass by that alien gaze. Then he smiled, and the expression was so genuinely warm, so unexpectedly human, that she almost cried. "He's looking right at us," Marcus whispered. "How is he looking right at us?" The stranger raised his hand, not in greeting, but in a gesture Sarah somehow understood meant wait. Then he turned toward the eastern approach to the base, where the sound of shuffling feet and rattling breath announced the arrival of more infected. Dozens of them, drawn by the light and sound of the ship's landing. Sarah grabbed her binoculars with shaking hands. Through the lenses, she watched an army of the dead converge on the lone figure. Former soldiers, civilians, children whose small bodies had been corrupted into instruments of mindless hunger. They moved with the inexorable certainty of a tide, and the man stood perfectly still at their center. "Get down from there," Sarah found herself whispering, though she knew he couldn't hear her. "Run, you fool! Run!" The infected closed within 50 yards, 40, 30. The man's eyes began to glow, not the sick yellow of a predator's eyes in darkness, but a clean red light that seemed to burn away shadows. He rose from the ground, actually rose, his feet leaving the earth as if gravity had simply forgotten about him. The infected reached the spot where he'd been standing and looked up with their dead, milky eyes. Twin beams of crimson light swept across the horde. The infected didn't just die, they unmade themselves. Where the light touched, flesh and bone became ash, then nothing at all. In seconds, the army of the dead had been reduced to empty air and echoing silence. The man descended slowly, his feet touching earth that had been cleansed of corruption. Sarah's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the binoculars. In 5 years of fighting for humanity's survival, she had never seen anything like this, never dared to hope for anything like this. The stranger walked toward their building with measured steps. Sarah could hear her team scrambling, weapons being readied, desperate whispers of "What do we do?" and "Is he friendly?" But she couldn't look away from those ancient eyes, couldn't shake the feeling that her entire life had been leading to this moment. He stopped at the base of the communications tower and spoke. His voice carried clearly through the thin air, rich and resonant, and speaking perfect English with an accent she couldn't place. "My name is Keth of Valorian. I have traveled very far to reach your world, and I have arrived to find it dying." He paused, looking up at the windows where Sarah knew they were watching. "I am here to help, if you will allow it. Your species deserves better than extinction." Sarah felt tears on her cheeks and realized she was crying. When had she started crying? When had she forgotten how? "I know you have no reason to trust me," Keth continued. "I know you have been betrayed before, by your own kind and by the forces that brought this plague to your world. But I ask you to consider this. What do you have to lose?" "Everything," Sarah thought. "We have everything to lose, and nothing left to lose it to." She keyed her comm unit with trembling fingers. "Marcus, Jenny, Rodriguez, stand down. Lower your weapons." "Sarah, what are you—" "Lower your weapons!" The command came out harsher than she'd intended, but she didn't have time for debate. She was already moving toward the exit, toward the stairs that would take her down to ground level, toward the first hope she'd felt since the world ended. She found him waiting by the building's entrance, hands clasped behind his back like a patient teacher. Up close, she could see details that made her alien sense tingle. Skin that was too perfect, movements that were too fluid, and those eyes that held depths like staring into deep space. "Captain Mitchell," he said, and Sarah's heart nearly stopped. "Former 341st Operations Group, last known survivor of the Malmstrom evacuation. You have done remarkable work keeping your people alive. How do you know my name?" The question came out as a croak. "I have been listening to your radio transmissions. You and the other survivor communities have been broadcasting for months, trying to coordinate, to find hope." His smile was sad now. "Your courage in the face of impossible odds is why I am here." Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her sidearm, then stopped. If this being wanted to hurt them, he wouldn't need to get close. She'd just watched him unmake dozens of infected with a glance. "What are you?" she asked instead. "I am what you might call a refugee," Keth replied. "My world fell to darkness long ago, and I have spent lifetimes searching for others who might be saved from the same fate. Your Earth, your people. You fight with such determination, such hope. It reminds me of what I lost." Behind her, Sarah could hear her team taking positions in the building, ready to provide cover fire if things went wrong. The thought almost made her laugh. Cover fire against a being who could fly and shoot energy from his eyes. "The infected," she said. "Can you really stop them? All of them?" Keth's expression grew troubled. "I can destroy them, yes. But the plague that created them is more complex than simple reanimation. It will take time to cleanse your world completely. Time and the cooperation of your surviving communities. There aren't many of us left. More than you know." His eyes held hers steadily. "I have been monitoring radio signals across your planet. There are survivor enclaves on every continent, some with populations in the thousands. You are not as alone as you believe. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Thousands of survivors? After 5 years of believing they were among the last humans alive, the possibilities seemed too vast to comprehend. I want to help them, Keth continued. I want to help you rebuild. But I cannot do this alone. I need guides, people who understand how your societies functioned, who can help coordinate relief efforts and rebuilding. You're asking us to trust you with the future of our species. I am asking you to trust me with the present, the future you will build yourselves. Sarah looked back at the communications center where her team waited. Marcus, barely out of his teens when the world ended. Jenny, who'd lost her husband and children in the first wave. Rodriguez, who hadn't spoken about his life before but still carried photos of people who were probably dead. Her people, her responsibility. She looked at the alien ship, beautiful and impossible, representing possibilities she'd trained herself not to imagine. Then she looked at Keth, this being who claimed to be their salvation, and saw something in his eyes that made her decision for her. She saw grief, ancient, profound grief that mirrored her own. He knew what it meant to lose everything. "What do you need from us?" she asked. Keth's smile was like sunrise. "First, I need you to help me reach the other communities. Your radio network is more extensive than they realize. Then, I need you to help me understand your world as it was, so I can help you build it as it should be. And after that? After that, Captain Mitchell, we give your species the second chance it deserves." As if summoned by his words, the sound of aircraft engines echoed across the sky. Sarah looked up to see contrails painting white lines against the blue, the first she'd seen in 2 years. Military jets, flying in formation, heading towards some distant crisis. "They're still fighting," she breathed. "They are still hoping," Keth corrected. "And as long as hope remains, salvation is possible." He extended his hand to her, and Sarah realized she was standing at the fulcrum of history. Behind her lay 5 years of death and desperation, the slow extinction of everything humanity had built. Before her stood the possibility of redemption, offered by a stranger from the stars who had no reason to care about their dying world, except that he chose to. Sarah took his hand. His skin was warm, surprisingly human, and his grip was gentle despite strength that could reshape continents. "Welcome to Earth," she said, and for the first time in years she smiled and meant it. The future was uncertain, and the road ahead would be long and difficult. But as Keth's ship hummed with alien harmonics, and the first truly clean wind in 5 years stirred the ash of the dead, Sarah Mitchell allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the war was not lost after all. Maybe salvation really could fall from the sky. 3 weeks after first contact, Sarah's world had expanded beyond anything she dared imagine. The communications center at Fort Harrison had been transformed into something resembling mission control for a war against extinction itself. Banks of salvaged radios hummed with constant chatter, their displays painting a real-time picture of hope spreading across a broken planet. Sarah sat at the central console, coordinating between survivor communities that had been isolated islands in an ocean of death just days before. "Detroit Underground? This is Montana Base," she spoke into her headset, watching signal strength indicators dance across multiple screens. "We have confirmation of supply drop completion. How are your people holding up?" The voice that crackled back through the static belonged to Commander James Torres, former Marine Corps logistics officer, who'd been leading the Detroit survivors from the city's abandoned subway tunnels. "Montana Base, you're not going to believe this. Our Angel just cleared the entire Renaissance Center complex. 15 blocks of infected, gone in under 20 minutes. We've got people crying, Sarah. Actual tears of joy." Sarah smiled, though Torres couldn't see it. She'd been hearing variations of this report for days now, as Keth systematically visited survivor communities across North America. Each radio transmission brought news that would have seemed impossible just a month ago. Massive infected populations eliminated overnight. Supply lines established between previously isolated groups. Hope restored to communities that had been preparing for their final stand. "Copy that, Detroit. What's your current population count?" "We're up to 412, Torres replied. and Sarah could hear the wonder in his voice. People are coming out of hiding, Sarah, coming back to the surface. Yesterday we had maybe 60 souls down here, and now... The transmission was interrupted by another voice breaking through on a different frequency. Sarah quickly switched channels. Montana Base, this is Perth Station calling. Emergency priority. Sarah's blood went cold. Perth Station was Dr. Elizabeth Hawkins' mining colony in the Australian outback, one of the most isolated survivor communities they'd established contact with. 300 people, including families with children, living in converted mine shafts while the infected roamed the surface. Perth Station, this is Montana Base. Go ahead, Dr. Hawkins. Sarah, thank God. Hawkins's British accent was thick with exhaustion and fear. We're in serious trouble here. Something's gone wrong with our water filtration system, and we've got maybe 18 hours before we're completely dry. The children are already showing signs of dehydration. Sarah felt the familiar weight of command settle on her shoulders. 3 weeks ago, this would have been a death sentence for the Perth colony. But now... Stand by, Perth Station. Sarah switched to a secure channel she'd never imagined would exist. Keth, are you monitoring? The response came immediately, that familiar calm voice that had become the soundtrack to humanity's resurrection. I'm here, Sarah. I heard Dr. Hawkins' transmission. How far are you from Australia? Currently over the Atlantic, but distance is not a concern. I can reach Perth within the hour. Sarah marveled at the casual way he said it. Within the hour. To cross half the planet in 60 minutes would have been science fiction a month ago. Now it was simply Tuesday. What do you need us to do? Have Dr. Hawkins gather her people in the main excavation chamber. I'll need them away from the surface for what I'm planning. Sarah frowned. In the 3 weeks since their alliance began, Keth had never asked people to take shelter from his activities. His methods had been surgical, precise, leaving human infrastructure untouched while eliminating infected populations with an efficiency that bordered on miraculous. Keth, what aren't you telling us? A pause. In that silence, Sarah heard something she'd never detected in the alien's voice before. Uncertainty. The infected in the Australian outback have been evolving, adapting to my previous interventions. They've learned to spread out, to burrow underground. Standard elimination techniques won't work. How bad is it? Bad enough that I'll need to use methods that might be dramatic. Before Sarah could ask for clarification, another voice joined their conversation. Montana Base, this is Geneva Stronghold. We're monitoring your transmission. Dr. Anna Volkov, former WHO epidemiologist, now leader of the largest survivor community in Europe. 8,000 people living in a fortified compound in the Swiss Alps, sustained by carefully rationed supplies and the kind of discipline that came from watching civilization collapse in real time. Dr. Volkov, Sarah acknowledged. What's your status? We've been tracking unusual infected movement across the European continent. Large groups converging on our position from multiple directions. It's coordinated, Sarah. They're working together. The chill that ran down Sarah's spine had nothing to do with the Montana weather. Coordinated infected meant evolution, adaptation, intelligence. It meant the enemy was learning. How many? Keth's voice had taken on a different quality, harder and more focused. Our scouts estimate between 50 and 60,000, arriving from the ruins of Munich, Milan, and Lyon simultaneously. They'll reach our perimeter within 48 hours. Sarah stared at her console displays, watching the scattered points of light that represented humanity's last strongholds. For 3 weeks, they'd been celebrating victory after victory as Keth systematically cleared infected populations. But if the enemy was adapting, learning to coordinate... Keth, she said quietly, what aren't you telling us about this plague? Another pause, longer this time. When Keth spoke again, his voice carried the weight of terrible knowledge. The infection was never purely biological. It carries programming, quantum-level instructions that allow it to adapt, to evolve countermeasures against threats. On my world, we called it the Grey Tide. It consumed everything before we learned to fight it. Your world fell to this same plague? Not the same, similar. The universe has many threats, Sarah, and this is one of the most persistent. It spreads between worlds, adapting to each new environment, learning from each victory and defeat. Sarah felt the room spin around her. You're saying this thing is, what, some kind of galactic parasite? Think of it as a test, Keth replied. A challenge that species must overcome to prove they deserve to continue existing. Most fail. The radio channels erupted with chatter as survivor communities across the globe processed this revelation. Sarah could hear fear creeping back into voices that had grown confident over the past weeks. But we're not going to fail, Keth continued, his voice cutting through the chaos. Because you have something my people didn't when we faced the tide. What's that? You have me. Before anyone could respond, the radio exploded with Dr. Hawkins' voice from Perth Station. My God, what is that light? Sarah quickly switched back to the Australian frequency. Through the static, she could hear sounds unlike anything she'd experienced. A deep thrumming that seemed to come from the earth itself, accompanied by a high harmonic that made her teeth ache. Dr. Hawkins, report! Sarah, you have to see this, Hawkins was shouting over the noise. The entire sky above the outback is glowing. It's like someone's rewriting reality. Sarah grabbed her headset, trying to make sense of the cacophony coming through the Perth Station feed. In the background, she could hear children laughing and adults crying, voices raised in wonder and disbelief. The infected, Hawkins continued, her voice barely audible over the cosmic symphony playing out above Australia. They're not just dying, Sarah. They're dissolving. The plague itself is being burned away at the molecular level. The ground, the air, even the water table, everything's being cleansed. Sarah looked at her global communications display, watching data streams from monitoring stations around the Pacific Rim. Seismic activity was spiking across the Australian continent, but it wasn't destruction. It was reconstruction. The very Earth was being healed. Keth, she whispered into her secure channel, what did you just do? His response came through clearly despite the electromagnetic chaos surrounding Australia. I gave them clean water, Sarah. And I gave them a clean world to drink it in. The implications hit her like a physical blow. If Keith could cleanse entire continents, could rewrite reality at the molecular level, then why hadn't he simply fixed everything from the beginning? The energy expenditure is enormous, Keth answered her unspoken question. I can do this perhaps 3 more times before I need to recuperate. We need to choose our targets wisely. Sarah stared at her displays, at the points of light representing the last remnants of human civilization. Perth Station was secure, but Geneva Stronghold faced 60,000 coordinated infected. Detroit Underground was thriving, but reports were coming in of massive infected movements across the eastern seaboard. Every community they'd contacted had become a target as the plague adapted to their new alliance. Dr. Volkov, Sarah called out. Geneva Stronghold, what's your current defensive capability? We have perhaps 6 hours of sustained fire before our ammunition runs low, Volkov replied grimly. After that, we'll be fighting with farming tools and determination. Keth, can you reach Geneva in time? I can, but Sarah, you need to understand something. The infected are learning to anticipate my arrival. They're coordinating across continents now, forcing me to choose between communities. For every group I save, another may fall. The weight of command had never felt heavier. Sarah looked around the communications center, at her team monitoring dozens of conversations simultaneously. Marcus was coordinating supply drops between Texas communities. Jenny was providing tactical advice to a group of survivors fortifying a school in Oregon. Rodriguez was helping translate communications between Spanish-speaking communities in the Southwest. They'd become the nervous system of a humanity fighting for its life. And now they had to make decisions that would determine which communities lived and which died. Geneva Stronghold, Sarah said finally. Sarah, we're sending Keth your way. ETA approximately 2 hours. Can you hold that long? We'll hold, Volkov replied, and Sarah could hear automatic weapons fire beginning in the background. We've survived this long. We can survive 2 more hours. Perth Station, how's your situation? Stable and improving by the minute, Doctor, Hawkins reported. The children are playing in actual sunlight for the first time in years, Sarah. Sunlight that doesn't carry plague spores. It's like watching them remember how to be human. Sarah felt tears threatening again. In 3 weeks, she'd experienced more emotional whiplash than in the previous 5 years combined. Terror and hope, despair and joy, all compressed into moments that would reshape the future of her species. "All stations, this is Montana Base," she announced on the general frequency. "We're entering a new phase of operations. The infected are adapting, coordinating, learning to counter our advantages. From this point forward, we need to assume every engagement will be a battle for survival." Acknowledgements poured in from around the globe. Communities that had been isolated islands of fear were now part of a global network, connected by radio waves and shared determination. "But remember this," Sarah continued, her voice strengthening with conviction. "We are no longer alone. We have an ally who has traveled across the universe to stand with us. We have each other, connected by more than just radio signals, connected by the shared belief that humanity deserves to survive." As if summoned by her words, the console erupted with incoming transmissions. New communities were broadcasting for the first time, emerging from hiding as word of Keth's intervention spread. A research station in Antarctica, a floating city of survivors on the Great Lakes, a group of families living in the New York subway system. Humanity was awakening from its long nightmare, and Sarah Mitchell found herself at the center of the most important communications network in history. They were no longer just surviving, they were coordinating, planning, rebuilding. But as reports continued to flow in of massive infected movements and coordinated attacks, Sarah knew the real war was just beginning. The plague was adapting faster than anyone had anticipated, and even Keth's incredible powers had limits. The next 48 hours would determine whether humanity's second chance would become permanent salvation or their final, cruelest hope. 72 hours after the Geneva stronghold siege ended, Sarah stood in the ruins of Washington, D.C., watching the impossible unfold. The morning sky was painted in shades of amber and gold, cleaner than it had been in 5 years. No ash fell from the heavens, no toxic winds carried the stench of decay. For the first time since the outbreak began, the nation's capital was truly silent. Not the terrible silence of the dead, but the peaceful quiet of a world holding its breath. Keth floated 30 feet above the National Mall, his form outlined against the dawn like a figure from forgotten mythology. But Sarah could see the cost of their victories written in the slight tremor of his hands, the way his usual perfect composure had developed hairline cracks. 3 continental cleansings in 4 days, Australia, Europe, and now the eastern seaboard, had pushed even his alien physiology to its limits. "Sarah." His voice reached her without need for radio transmission, carried on some frequency that bypassed her ears and spoke directly to her mind. "The convergence is beginning." She raised her binoculars, scanning the horizon beyond the mall. What she saw made her stomach clench with familiar dread, despite everything they'd accomplished. The infected weren't just coming. They were flowing like a dark tide from every direction simultaneously. Millions of them, moving with purpose and coordination that should have been impossible for creatures driven by mindless hunger. "How many?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know. "Approximately 12 million, converging from a radius of 800 miles. Every remaining infected on the continent, moving as a single organism." Sarah's radio crackled with reports from the hastily established perimeter. Her team had spread thin across the city, coordinating with the few military units that had survived the past 5 years. General Patricia Hayes, former Pentagon logistics coordinator, had emerged from the deep bunkers beneath Arlington with nearly 200 soldiers. Major David Chen commanded a group of Marines who'd been holding the Smithsonian like a fortress. Captain Lisa Rodriguez, no relation to her own Rodriguez, led Air Force personnel operating from a secured runway at Reagan National. "Montana Base, this is Perimeter North," came Marcus's voice through her earpiece. The kid had insisted on taking point at the Lincoln Memorial, despite Sarah's protests. Visual confirmation of the main wave. "Sarah, they're not moving like infected anymore. They're moving like an army." Through her binoculars, Sarah could see what Marcus meant. The approaching horde moved in formations, with faster infected scouts ranging ahead, and massive clusters of the most dangerous variants forming the center mass. Worst of all, they were using tools, crude weapons fashioned from debris, coordinated to maximize their effectiveness against human defenses. "All stations, this is Montana Base," Sarah broadcast on the general frequency. Confirm visual contact with primary convergence. Estimated time to contact is 47 minutes. Jenny's voice came through from her position atop the Washington Monument. Sarah, you need to see this. The infected. They're not just coordinating locally. I'm watching groups that should be attacking each other working together. Former military infected are directing civilian variants. It's like they're remembering things. The implications chilled Sarah more than the morning air. If the plague could preserve and utilize memories, if it could learn not just to adapt but to strategize. Keth, she called out. What aren't you telling us about this convergence? He descended slowly until his feet touched the steps of the Lincoln Memorial beside her. Up close, Sarah could see the exhaustion etched into his alien features, the way his usually luminous eyes had dimmed to a tired glow. The plague learns from every world it consumes, Keth said quietly. It takes the knowledge, the tactical understanding, the collective memory of each species, and incorporates it into itself. What you're seeing now is 5 years of absorbed human intelligence being directed against you. Can you stop them? Like you did in Australia and Europe? Keth was quiet for a long moment, staring at the approaching tide of corruption. Sarah, I need to tell you something about my people, about what really happened to Valorian. She turned to face him fully, seeing something in his expression that made her heart race with new fear. We had powers like mine, though not as concentrated in individuals. We were a civilization of what you might call minor gods. We could manipulate matter, energy, even time to some degree. When the gray tide reached our world, we were confident we could defeat it. But you didn't. We won. Actually, we cleansed our entire planet, eliminated every trace of the infection. We celebrated our victory for exactly 14 hours. Sarah felt ice form in her veins. What happened after 14 hours? The plague returned, but it wasn't just the original infection anymore. It had learned from us. It came back using our own power, our own knowledge, wielding abilities we had taught it by fighting it. In trying to save our world, we had given the enemy everything it needed to destroy us completely. The radio chatter around them continued, reports of the approaching convergence, but Sarah could barely hear it over the sound of her own heartbeat. You're saying that every time you use your powers against this thing, I'm teaching it. Yes. Keth's smile was heartbreakingly sad. Every cleansing, every demonstration of my abilities, every miracle I've performed for your people. The plague has been watching, learning, adapting. Then why did you do it? Why help us if you knew it would make things worse? Because, Sarah Mitchell, sometimes the only way to win an impossible war is to change what victory means. Before she could ask what he meant, the horizon erupted with movement. The infected weren't just approaching anymore. They were charging, moving with speed and coordination that defied everything humanity thought it knew about the plague. Sarah could see variants she'd never encountered before. Infected that moved like liquid shadow, others that seemed to phase in and out of existence, creatures that bore the twisted marks of Keith's own power, turned against itself. All stations, contact in 15 minutes, Sarah broadcast, her training taking over despite the existential terror clawing at her mind. Weapons free, engage at maximum range. The sound of gunfire erupted across the city as her perimeter teams opened up on the advancing horde. But Sarah could see through her binoculars that conventional weapons were having minimal effect. The infected had learned to armor themselves with debris, to use cover, to coordinate suppressing fire using thrown objects and their own bodies as shields. Keth, whatever you're planning, now would be a good time. He was already rising into the air, but instead of the confident ascent she'd grown accustomed to, his flight seemed labored, uncertain. Sarah, I need you to gather all the survivors to the underground facilities beneath the Capitol building. Get them as deep as possible. What are you going to do? I'm going to give this plague exactly what it wants. All of my power, all of my knowledge, everything I am. He looked down at her, and Sarah saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Fear. But I'm going to give it to them all at once. Understanding hit her like a physical blow. Keth, no, there has to be another way. There is no other way, Sarah. The plague will continue to adapt, to learn, to spread between worlds until it has consumed everything. But if I can overload it, Force it to absorb more power than it can process. You'll die. I'll die anyway, eventually. But this way, my death means something. The infected had reached the outer perimeter. Sarah could hear Marcus calling for support. Jenny coordinating sniper fire, the sound of combat growing closer by the minute. Through her radio, she heard General Hayes report that the Arlington positions were being overrun. "Keth, please, we just found hope again. Don't take it away from us." He descended until he was standing directly in front of her, close enough that she could see her own reflection in his alien eyes. "Sarah, hope isn't something that can be taken away. It's something that lives inside people, that grows stronger when shared. You've built a network that connects survivors across the globe. You've shown them that they're not alone. That hope will survive, even if I don't." The infected had broken through the inner perimeter. Sarah could see them flowing over the barriers her teams had erected, moving with inhuman speed and coordination. In minutes, they would reach the mall itself. "There's something else," Keth continued, his voice urgent now. "When I overload the plague, when I force it to absorb all of my power at once, there will be effects, changes to your world, to your people. Not everyone will survive the transition, but those who do, what kind of changes? Your species will take its next evolutionary step. You'll develop abilities, resistances, connections to each other that will ensure the plague can never threaten you again. You'll become something more than human, but something that remembers what humanity meant." Sarah stared at him, processing the magnitude of what he was describing. "You're not just saving us, you're transforming us into something that can save others. Yes, into something that can carry the light to other worlds facing the same darkness." The infected had reached the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Sarah could see their faces now. Former soldiers, citizens, children whose features had been twisted by 5 years of corruption but who still retained enough human intelligence to coordinate their attack. Behind them came millions more, a living tsunami of everything humanity had lost. "Sarah," Keth said gently, "it's time to go." She looked at him one last time. This being who had traveled across the universe to save a world that wasn't his own, who was about to sacrifice everything to give her species a future they couldn't have imagined. Will it hurt? For me? Yes, probably. For your people? It will feel like waking up from a long, terrible dream. Sarah keyed her radio for a final transmission. "All stations, this is Montana Base. Fall back to deep shelter immediately. Repeat, fall back to deep shelter. Something wonderful is about to happen." She turned and ran toward the Capitol building, hearing the sound of her teams acknowledging the order, pulling back from positions they'd fought so hard to hold. Behind her, she heard Keith rising into the air one final time, his voice carrying across the city with impossible clarity. "I am Keith of Valorian, last son of a world consumed by darkness. I offer myself willingly to the plague that threatens this world, not in surrender, but in defiance. Take my power, take my knowledge, take everything I am." Sarah reached the Capitol steps and turned for one last look. Keth hung suspended above the National Mall, his form beginning to burn with light that hurt to look at directly. The infected had stopped their advance, standing transfixed as something beyond their understanding began to unfold. "But know this," Keth's voice continued, growing stronger as his form grew brighter. "In taking my power, you will also take my purpose. In absorbing my knowledge, you will also absorb my love for this world and its people. You will become what I am. Not a destroyer, but a protector." The light emanating from Keth's form began to pulse, and Sarah could feel something fundamental changing in the air around her. The infected weren't just standing still anymore. They were beginning to change, their corrupted forms wavering as if they were reflections in disturbed water. "Sarah!" Marcus's voice crackled through her radio. "Whatever's happening, it's spreading globally. Perth Station reports the same phenomenon. Geneva Stronghold confirms. Every infected on the planet is... I don't know how to describe it. They're turning into light." Sarah reached the Capitol bunker entrance and paused at the threshold. Above her, Keth's sacrifice was reaching its crescendo. his form now indistinguishable from a miniature star. The plague was taking his power, just as he'd intended. But in doing so, it was also taking his purpose, his compassion, his determination to protect rather than destroy. The infected on the mall weren't infected anymore. They were glowing with the same light that emanated from Keith, their corrupted forms dissolving as the plague that had animated them was rewritten at the quantum level. In their place, something new was emerging. Forms that looked human, but carried sparks of alien light in their eyes. People who had been lost to the plague but were now being returned, changed but whole. And to you, Sarah Mitchell. Keth's voice reached her one final time. I leave the greatest gift I can give. The responsibility of shepherding your people into their new form, of teaching them to use their gifts wisely, of ensuring that when they reach for the stars, they do so with hope rather than hunger. The light reached critical intensity, and Sarah threw herself into the bunker as reality itself seemed to restructure around Keth's sacrifice. The last thing she saw before the blast doors sealed was her world being reborn in alien fire. When she emerged 3 days later, the earth was green again. The sky was blue. The air smelled of growing things rather than death and corruption. And walking among the flowering trees of a national mall that had been a wasteland just days before, she found the first of the changed, former infected whose humanity had been restored and enhanced, people who could heal with a touch, who could communicate across vast distances without technology, who carried in their eyes the same ancient compassion she'd seen in Keth's gaze. They looked to her for guidance, these new guardians of a reborn world. And Sarah Mitchell, former Air Force captain turned coordinator of humanity's resurrection, smiled and began to teach them about the stranger from the stars who had given everything to give them a second chance. In the years that followed, when Earth's children finally reached for other worlds, they carried with them not conquest, but aid, not hunger, but hope. They became the light that Keth had been, protectors rather than destroyers, saviors rather than conquerors. And in the quiet moments between saving civilizations, they remembered the alien who had shown them that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from winning an impossible war, but from choosing to redefine what victory means. The war against the plague was over. The age of humanity's guardianship of the universe had begun.